Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Spring, it isn't just for outdoor garden tasks. Your houseplants need some springtime love as well. We chat with the author of Houseplant Warrior, Raffaele DiLallo, about your houseplants' needs for the right light, the right humidity, and he has a list of easy care houseplants for low light conditions. He's based in Cleveland, Ohio, and Raffaele also has some houseplant advice for those who also must muddle through cold, dark winters. And we talk about his business, OhioTropics.com. And yes, he is growing outdoor tropical plants in Cleveland, even a banana plant. Also, we get a quick tip from America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, who explains how careful pruning of outdoor plants can lessen the threat from pests and disease. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots. And we'll do it all in under 30 minutes. Let's go. My next guest has been growing houseplants for over 30 years. His name is Raffaele DiLallo, and Raffaele has a new book out called Houseplant Warrior, 7 Keys to Unlocking the Mysteries of Houseplant Care. It's a wonderful book, and he has a wonderful website as well, OhioTropics.com. And Raffaele, it's interesting how you got into the houseplant habit. It was due to your father's habit.
That's right. So my father smoked quite heavily when I was growing up, and so he's up to 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and I just hated it. And I remember, I think I started growing houseplants sometime, and I was definitely in grade school or middle school, and my family's always gardened, so as long as I can remember, I've always grown plants. But the houseplant thing started because I think I had read somewhere when I was a kid that houseplants cleaned your air. And of course, I liked plants to begin with, but that was a good excuse, to start to hoard houseplants. So I started, filling up all of our windowsills and our windows in middle school.
That's a very David Sedaris type of thing to develop as a child. Very good. I like that. And what's interesting, too, is your college degree is in, chemical engineering?
Yes, it is. And I actually just quit my corporate job back in November of 2021 to focus on my website and my blog and my writing and everything else that will crop up from this.
And congratulations on that, too. I mean, for starting up the blog in 2017 and having it zoom to the top of the charts, you've put a lot of work into that and all your consultations and a lot of other things that we'll point out on this little journey we will take here today. OhioTropics.com. Talk a little bit about your website.
Sure. So it's funny how it started because I started it 5 years ago. And like you mentioned, it was in March, actually. And it all started because one of my friends who was moving from the West Coast to the Cleveland area where I am, she called me and she said, I think you should start a blog. And she said, I follow this one lady out west. And, I receive her newsletter and she tells me when I need to do things with my plants and what I need to do. And she said, I found it so helpful. And she said, you know so much about plants. I think you should start a blog. And so when I get excited about something, I go full force. And so the next day I started my website and I had always thought about it, but that was the catalyst to really actually do something about it. So that's how it all started. And it initially started, I almost wish I hadn't chosen the word OhioTropics because, I don't want to regionalize myself, but it originally started because I wanted to start writing about growing tropical plants outside in cold weather gardens to give them a tropical flair. So that's really how it started. And I did start talking about writing about orchids as well, but that was the idea behind my blog. But then it segued into pretty much all houseplant care and tropical plant care from there.
Well, here's our first scenic bypass of the day. What sort of success have you had growing tropical plants outdoors in Ohio?
Oh, gosh, it's wonderful. And it's about to get easier for me because I'm about to get a greenhouse this spring, which I'm super, super excited about. I mean, I've overwintered some stuff, indoors. Some stuff I treat like annuals, and then other things come back. And some people may be shocked to know that you can grow, there's a hardy banana plant that you can grow in all 50 states if you have protection. Where I live, you would need some winter protection. And I get lazy though. And so one year I planted this hardy banana. It's Musa basjoo is the botanical name. And it came back the second season and it got maybe 9 or 10 feet tall. It was spectacular. But I think the area that I planted it in, we have really bad, heavy clay soil here. And we had a particularly wet winter, that second winter that I was trying to overwinter it, so it rotted. But I am going to try again this year, put it in a better location. And, if you have good, well-drained soil that's not staying super wet in the winter, and you mulch it in my area, it will come back. And it's really cool to be able to grow something like that in my area as well.
Cleveland is in which USDA zone?
So if you look on a map, there's a little strip right along the lake that's supposedly 6A. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure I believe that, though. Where I am, it might be bordering 6A or 5B. So it really depends on where you live within the city.
All gardening is local, as I used to say a lot.
That's true.
Yeah, it's very true. And as you point out, every yard has a microclimate where you can do a little zone extending and try out different plants. I would think in your situation, trying to grow basically what we would grow outdoors here in USDA Zone 9, outdoors there, you're doing a lot of work in pots, I would think.
I am. I do a lot of things in pots. And like I said, it'll be easier once I get my greenhouse. I could just shove them in the greenhouse. Speaking about the microclimates in our old house before we moved, I have a couple more examples that might be very interesting for whoever's listening. And, the importance of microclimates and really the power of them if you can create one, a suitable one. So I actually had elephant ears. So, just a plain old Colocasia esculenta or taro root. And I planted them in my backyard in my old house in the corner. So there was a nice protected corner next to where our air conditioner was. And the house itself was aluminum siding, but the bottom of the house had a strip of the base of the house was brick. And so I planted it right in that corner, right next to the brick. And those things came back every single year with no added protection or mulch. And so I got this gigantic, huge clump of these colocasias that came back every year, and I was shocked. But, that's the microclimate, and the soil there, it dried out, sufficiently, and it didn't stay wet in the winter. And it just, next to the brick, I'm sure that helped with, maintaining a warmer microclimate. And then one year I even had dahlias come back in a raised bed, not a raised bed, but just in a bed that I had in the front garden that I had. And that was a little bit mulched at the time, but we have very unpredictable weather here. So it can vary drastically, but you can be surprised what you can grow if you have a good microclimate.
Were those elephant's ears growing on a southern or a western exposure?
So those were actually so that side of the house was facing east. Yeah, so they would get some morning sun and, midday sun and then nothing after that.
All right, because here in California, if you're growing elephant's ears, and we can grow them outdoors here, you're growing them on the north side of the house because they need a lot of shade here.
Yeah, and I find that they can tolerate a lot of sun as long as you keep them well watered.
I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, smart pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with smart pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with smart pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pot's lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. We're talking with Raffaele DiLallo, author of the book Houseplant Warrior, available wherever you get your books. Let's talk about raising houseplants in Ohio and in cold climates. I know a little bit about houseplants here in California, obviously, but what sort of precautions do people in USDA zones 6 and 5 and even lower have to take? What are some of the considerations that they have to keep in mind?
You know, like you said, it can vary a lot depending on where you live. And the number one thing that comes to mind is light. I know yourself, living in California, you don't have to worry about that. But where I live, and I think it's not even the USDA zone, but I feel like, of course, that's very important as well. But where I live, I feel like we're cursed. Our geographical location here on Lake Erie, especially on the east side of Cleveland, we have really dark winters and very cloudy days. And we're one of the cloudiest cities, I believe, in the country, especially in the winter. And with the shorter days and the clouds, it can really pose a challenge to growing houseplants. So what I like to do, at least in my sunroom, so I have supplemental lighting that I add, and I actually have them year round, but it especially helps out during the winter time when we have those really short days. Plants can really sulk if they don't have enough light in the winter time with yellow leaves and, reduced growth. They'll struggle. So light definitely is the number one thing. Of course, temperature as well. Well, actually, another thing to be aware of, and this is something that I see with a lot of my readers. We have all these, cold, long, horrible days, many months of that. And so if you live in a cold climate like I do, and suddenly you have a nice warm day outside, many people are tempted to just pick up their houseplants and put them outside in the sun, straight from indoors. And they think they're doing something beneficial. What a lot of people don't realize is can't just move a houseplant from indoors straight outdoors immediately to full sun. Even if they are sun-loving plants, you cannot do that abruptly, otherwise they'll burn. So a lot of people don't realize that. I had someone reach out to me, she had her string of pearls and there was a nice day. She put it outside in the sun for a few hours and it totally bleached out. And I explained to her, even if you have a sun-loving plant, you have to put it in the shade for a few days, assuming the temperature is okay and warm enough for your particular plant. In order to let it get acclimated enough, then you have to slowly introduce more and more sun so that it doesn't burn. So that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And it's not that the plant doesn't like sun, you just have to acclimate the plant slowly enough so that it doesn't burn.
One thing we've heard often when it comes to light and houseplants, some people insist that if there's enough light in the room to read a book, your plants will be happy. Myth or not?
I've heard that as well. And I would say definitely for certain plants, that's probably fine. So certain low light plants would probably be fine with that. And if you're on the low end of, barely being able to read, it's probably not enough for most plants to really thrive. A lot of plants will tolerate that. Your peace lilies, snake plants or sansevierias, or, they're now classified into the Dracaena genus. They'll hang on for a while, but eventually they'll slow down and suffer too. Chinese evergreens too would tolerate that type of environment. Pothos is a great one. Heartleaf philodendron is also another one. So there are some plants that will definitely tolerate that, but don't expect them to thrive if you're on the low end of that light spectrum.
And we should point out as well that in your book, Houseplant Warrior, you highlight many of the plants you just mentioned, and it's a great little encyclopedia you have included in your book.
Thank you. There's also the myth of certain plants that are low light that, people think they're labeled low light too, in many cases, like snake plants and also rubber trees, Ficus elastica. But in fact, and I'm sure you see this in California, you grow those out, many people have those outdoors in full sun and they thrive that way. So, light is paramount. And just because something is labeled low light doesn't mean that it likes low light. It just means that it tolerates low light in many cases.
One of the dirty little secrets about growing plants outdoors in California is the fact that the stretch of coastal California from San Diego up to Eureka doesn't have that much sunlight. There's a lot of overcast marine layer fog that persists. And yes, you can get away with growing a Ficus benjamina in full exposure in a place like San Francisco or Santa Barbara or San Diego. But when you come inland, well, that's when the heat takes over. That's when the intense sun takes over. And that's when the humidity levels drop too. Here in the Central Valley of California, it's not uncommon this time of year, even and into the summer, of 10 to 20% humidity during the day or less. Whereas over on the coast, you've got 50, 60, 70% humidity because of the marine layer. Now, I would think there in Cleveland, you don't have to worry about humidity levels in the summertime, but in the wintertime, I would think that with heating units or fireplaces, do you have to supplement the humidity? Because you mentioned in your book that houseplants like a humidity level of like 50 or 60%.
Yes. So the thing with humidity is that I find a lot of people, I like to think of plant care holistically. So there's a lot of, you have to consider all the factors: light, your watering, your pots, your potting mixes, all of that works together. Humidity, temperature. And I talk about that in depth in the book in terms of the relationship between all those factors. But definitely for, indoors here, I do run a humidifier in the wintertime in my sunroom. Elsewhere in the house, I don't. But in the sunroom, I do run a humidifier. Many of our houseplants are native to tropical rainforest ecosystems, and so they do like higher humidity. But that being said, what's most important is being able to water properly. So if you're letting a lot of your leafy tropical plants dry out, get bone dry as far as their potting mix is concerned, that's going to cause a lot more harm to your plant and a lot more crispy brown edges on your leaves than low humidity ever will. Now, that's not to say that humidity is not important. If you have both, that's awesome. That's wonderful. But I like to point that out to people, that proper watering is more important. My indoor air can get painfully dry. And I notice from my skin too, my skin gets dry and flaky. It can get into the 30 percentile relative humidity indoors. So I do like to run a humidifier in my sunroom, at least in the 50 to 60 range if I can. Another thing to remember is if you increase your humidity levels, that we have to be aware of air circulation, because, we don't have wind indoors like we do outdoors. And so that becomes very important to try and prevent any fungal issues. So I have a ceiling fan that I put on low, sometimes to circulate the air a little bit. So that's an important factor too.
Well, that's a very good tip. Now, you mentioned earlier that you do use supplemental lights. Describe your lighting systems.
Yeah, so I experiment with different lights. And so right now, I use several different ones. In my sunroom right now, I have two, they're basically like shop lights, and they're just fluorescent T5 fixtures. And, they're working very well. Although I might switch it out to some LED lighting, which I also use in my light. I do have some plants and some lights in other areas of the house in my basement. I have one over my terrarium. So I have some full spectrum white LED lights that are performing amazingly for the plants. I don't like, I see a lot of those, this is just personal preference, those purple LED lights that you see. I think they're just, not aesthetically pleasing. And there's enough of a selection out there that, you can easily avoid that. But I'll probably at some point, get rid of these T5 fluorescents and do LEDs instead.
Are the T5s 4-foot fixtures with 2 bulbs in them?
Yes. Yeah, the skinny bulbs. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what they are.
And what is the distance from that light to the plants?
And so I actually have, so my sunroom faces, the long side of the window faces north, and then the short side of the wall faces east. And so I have those right above, near the ceiling of my north-facing wall. And as far as the distance goes, so I vary it depending on what the plant likes. So right now, I'm looking at I have a Burrow's tail succulent that's literally just a few inches under that. And then I have some plants on the floor as well. So I cater the distance depending on how much light the plant actually likes.
All right. Yeah, lighting, very important, especially where it is, like you say, dark in the wintertime there. Mm-hmm. This has been a pleasure talking with Raffaele DiLallo, author of Houseplant Warrior, 7 Keys to Unlocking the Mysteries of Houseplant Care. The website, OhioTropics.com. And if I'm not mistaken, you're also on Instagram.
I am. If you just look up OhioTropics, one word, I'm on Instagram. I'm also on YouTube and Facebook as well.
There you go. Raffaele DiLallo, author of Houseplant Warrior. I would say thanks for a few minutes of your time, but thanks for a very extended conversation about houseplants.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, Fred.
Because there are so many demands on your time these days, well, I like to keep the Garden Basics podcast to under 30 minutes. But still, there's a lot more to tackle on all the garden subjects we bring up on the podcast. So for that and a lot more, we're starting up the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter. It'll be on Substack. It'll go into more details about what you just heard on the latest podcast. So yes, it will be a good supplement for the Garden Basics podcast, but there'll be a lot more garden-related material and, probably pictures of my dogs and cats as well. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter. It's on Substack. And best of all, it's free. There's a link in today's show notes, or just go to Substack.com and do a search for the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred. That's Substack.com. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter. Did I tell you it's free? It's free. On a previous episode, we were discussing the chemical imidacloprid, which is a systemic for controlling all sorts of garden pests. And Debbie Flower mentioned this on that episode.
Sap comes out of the plant. It comes out in pretty high pressure, and the sucking insect often gets more than they can consume. And so it just goes right through their body or leaks out. And that's something that the ants like. And so the ants will protect the sucking insect from the beneficials. So I put out ant traps. If I had to take it a step further, there are much less toxic pesticides, including some of the horticultural oils that I could have used on the scale that would suffocate them. Insects breathe through their rear end, and so it would clog up their breathing pores. That would have been my next step, but I didn't need to do that. All I did was prune to open up the plant and control the ants.
Well, that raises some interesting questions, Debbie. Pruning to control pests. How does that work?
It works in a couple of ways. As with the hackberry, it opens the plant up that allows the beneficial insects that are going to come in and eat the scale or lay their babies in the scale, but functionally control the scale for us. I was looking at a rose recently at my son's house and happy that I had helped my daughter-in-law prune it because it was full of aphids, and that's happens commonly in spring when we have lots of new growth. And had we left it as dense as it was, previous to our pruning, it had been shorn. So it had been randomly cut into what one of my professors at Rutgers called them hockey pucks and meatballs. So geometric shape, a round ball with no attention paid to how the plant really grew. So we went in and, as you do with a rose, cleaned out the center. Took out the oldest canes, the thickest ones, down at the center, and left a sort of ring around the outside of a few of those, and then cut it back at the top. So the new growth is very attractive to the sucking insects, the aphids being the sucking insects, and they are now on that plant. But there were also adult lady beetles, lady beetle larvae, and lacewing larvae in that plant, and those three are consuming those aphids. So the balance of good bug to bad bug is pretty good on that plant right now, and had it been more congested, the lady beetles and lacewings could not have gotten in there to eat those aphids.
All right, so opening up a plant gives a bird's eye view, if you will, for the good guys who are flying in and spot something.
Exactly, yes. And then another way of pruning to remove pests is to actually physically cut them off. In parts of the country, we have bagworms, and they actually make a bag out of their own sort of like spider web stuff, own webbing material, and live inside of there and consume plant material protected by this bag. Well, you can just go out, and they're typically at the end in the young growth. You can just go out and cut the whole tip of the branch off and either put it in your green waste or put it in a soapy water container, and that will kill those pests.
Another springtime pest that does the same thing as the red-humped caterpillar, and you can usually spot them massed on the underside of many different trees and shrubs. And the easiest control method, cut off the branch where you see them and put it in the trash.
Right. I did that similar thing with aphids on a honeysuckle, an ornamental honeysuckle growing on a patio cover, and the new growth in spring was so full of aphids that all the leaves were distorted. When it gets to that level, even though those tips of those branches were out there where the beneficials could get to it, but when it got to that level, I just cut the tips off and put them in my green waste can.
There you go. A good quick tip. Your pruning shears as a pest control weapon. It works.
It sure does.
Debbie Flower, we're here in her garden. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Garden Basics comes out every Tuesday and Friday. It's brought to you by Smart Pots. Garden Basics is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes Apple, iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, Google, Podcast Addict, CastBox, and Pocket Casts. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and leaving comments. We appreciate it.